interested in this topic, so we want to make sure we have maximum amount of time to discuss. We're going to pick up largely where we left off last week. You can see I expanded, I added a few details. I just figured we could erase the old stuff and hit the new stuff. So I mentioned last week that in 1838, again, there was a lot of unrest in Germany after the Union Church was formed, where the Lutherans and the Reformed were merged into one church. It started kind of a mass exodus of people who actually cared about their religion. The problem was most people didn't care, which is why you could do things like merge Reformed and Lutherans together. So this mass exodus was going on in about 1938. A big group came to St. Louis, and then Friedrich Winnekin arrived in Baltimore, and he was a writer who planted a lot of churches in both Indiana and Michigan. These two groups got together along with a couple others and formed the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod, what it's known as now. Obviously at the time it was all German speaking. But because we touched on those last week, I want to get into kind of the specific Iowa thing. So in Germany, in 1848, I don't know if you guys, how much of your European history you remember from the 19th century. Especially the early 19th century in Europe was very bloody. There were a lot of fights, a lot of revolutions, a lot of kind of people going, hey, we want what they have in the United States. We want democracy. We want freedom. And so, most specifically, we think of the French Revolution. And that name is really a misnomer. There was not one French Revolution. There were about 10 French revolutions. And a lot of them were incredibly bloody. That came to Germany in 1848. The people tried to overthrow the imperial leadership. They wanted a parliament. They wanted a democratically elected government. It did not succeed. And why I put it on here is because, obviously, when revolutions don't succeed, anyone who is supportive of that revolution, now we're going to take off. You don't exactly want to stick around when you try to overthrow your government. Which created another huge wave of Germans coming to the United States. And this group settled farther west than previous groups had. This was what drove a lot of Lutherans to Iowa. So, there were a handful of Lutheran churches, 3 or 4, before 1853. Mostly in the southeastern corner of the state. We're talking Keokuk and Burlington. Just a couple right there, right up from Missouri, right along the river. But in 1853, the first concerted effort was made to send Lutheran missionaries to Iowa. They first went up the Mississippi River, and they first landed in Clayton County, and they started trying to outreach. They found a decent pocket in Clayton County, and then obviously down in Dubuque. In 1854, the first Lutheran seminary in Iowa was formed, Wartburg Theological Seminary. Still exists to this day. We won't talk about what Wartburg Theological Seminary teaches today. That's for another day. Let's just say you wouldn't recognize it as Lutheran. If you go to their webpage, on the front of their webpage, there's a lot of things about, we apologize that we're on stolen indigenous land. We are open to all LGBTQIA plus minus. That's what's on the front of their webpage. Nothing about Jesus, nothing about his death for us, all about just clicking the right social boxes. But we won't talk about Wartburg Theological Seminary. I just wanted to mention them because they started producing pastors. Obviously, at the time, they weren't nearly as concerned with the current 2025 social justice initiatives. In 1871, so we're going to fast forward 17 years, the first Lutheran missionary was sent to Sac County, Iowa. A lot of Germans were starting to settle in the area, and so he wasn't full-time assigned to Sac County, but he was riding through the area. I believe he ended up doing a lot of church planting down by Denison like that. But he came through Sac County. He, in fact, was in Wall Lake. I have the specific date that he was in Wall Lake here. August 3rd, 1871, Reverend Ansorg arrived in Wall Lake, but he found no Germans. So he felt that there was, at that time, no need to try to plant a church because he found no Germans in Wall Lake. 2 years later, in 1873, the first preaching station was established near Grant City and Auburn. At that point in time, I didn't include this on this list, but there was a pastor, Reverend P. Mertens, who would travel 6,000 miles on horseback over the course of a year and preached 169 different services. The guy got around. He sort of settled in Denison. He found a big section in Denison, and he got an assistant who stayed in Denison, the Reverend G. Har. Now, at that time, most funerals were not held with clergy. There just weren't a lot of clergy around. Obviously, if the one pastor in the area is riding over 6,000 miles on horseback in a year, there aren't a lot of pastors around. So most funerals at that time did not have clergy there. However, in 1873, William Dierenfeld's father died, and he insisted Dad needs to be buried by a Lutheran pastor. So he went to Denison. Reverend Har was more than willing to come up, and the first funeral service was held. It was a group that was south of town, and the first Lutheran service in the area was held in his dugout. They started holding Sunday services, usually in members' houses. When they outgrew members' houses, they bought an old schoolhouse. Let me see here. It specifically talked about 6 miles south and 1 mile east of town. So the first sort of church building south of Wall Lake was purchased. And they were meeting regularly, though they didn't have a pastor who was coming up regularly. 2 years later, in 1876, the Reverend F. Shug was assigned to Sac County, the first minister to be permanently assigned exclusively to Sac County. So, obviously, he's riding through Sac County. He's meeting with the different pockets of Lutherans. One of the groups he found was actually north of Wall Lake. It doesn't specifically say where north of Wall Lake. It just says that there was a group north of Wall Lake. Mr. Stock in Grant City specifically requested that he come because they had a whole group of children who had never been baptized.
I went through adult confirmation with Pastor Hilo. We looked up the oldest Lutheran church in Sac County, which his information shows Auburn.
Yes, that would match what this was. That kind of the first Lutheran church in the county was Auburn.
Grant City is right next to it.
Sure. But Grant City had requested Then they came over to north of Wall Lake, where they held a baptismal service. Because again, there weren't a lot of pastors at the time. A lot of the children who had been born in the United States had never been baptized. So, they held their first service where they baptized kids. Now, you guys remember your Wall Lake history better than I'm sure I do. What was where Wall Lake is, especially just south of town? Goose Pond. That's what was separating these two groups. You had Goose Pond in between the two. So, that's why you had separate groups, one north of town, one south of town, because it's not like they had cars. It's not like there was a bridge over Goose Pond. They had to ride around the pond. So they didn't want to necessarily be together. They probably didn't even know about each other. But in 1878, under the encouragement of Pastor Shug, these two groups merged. And they agreed to meet in the middle, in Wall Lake. So that was the basis of the initial founding of the congregation. It wasn't chartered yet as a congregation, but these two groups, the one north of town, the one south of town, agreed to meet in Wall Lake. Now in 1880, this group ran into a bit of a bump in the road. The problem was Pastor Shug was serving all of Sac County, every church in Sac County. So how often do you think he was in Wall Lake? It doesn't specifically say, but it does specifically mention that services were at irregular times. Since there was not a resident pastor, and the missionary Reverend Shug had many other stations. They speculate perhaps Wall Lake was not given as much attention as other places in the vicinity, since it was one of the least promising of the teaching stations in Pastor Shug's circuits. Again, we must remember that road conditions were such that travel was simply impossible in certain seasons. In addition to all this, the Lutherans in the Wall Lake vicinity were not too well blessed with this world's goods, so they did not have sufficient money to build a church of their own. So in 1880, they ran into a problem because Pastor Shug wasn't there very much. A pastor from another denomination asked for permission to start preaching in Wall Lake to this group. And there was, it specifically says there was no small amount of disagreement because there were some who favored this man strongly. They wanted to be served. They felt it was better to have a pastor, even if he wasn't Lutheran, than not. And others felt it was very important to maintain their Lutheran identity. So the group was divided on this. Some remained Lutheran, some, it specifically says the majority were loyal to the Lutheran faith. So there were some that split off. They do not specify in our church history what denomination this was. Personally, if I had to speculate, just knowing how the different denominations worked and did outreach, I would personally guess Methodist. They tended to be very aggressive, moving into new areas. Entirely possible it's Presbyterian, just because of how heavily the area is Presbyterian. But it does not specifically say, so I'm simply speculating. So what they ultimately decided to do was we need to get a pastor in who can serve us. So they found a seminary student in Arcadia who was, he was looking for what we would call a vicarage. He needed a church to serve while he was learning how to be a pastor. Kind of worked under Pastor Shug, and he was called to basically serve Wall Lake for a year and they paid him the whopping sum. Anyone know how much Mr. Meineke was offered for the year? For a year's salary.
$200.
Less than that, slightly more than that.
$120 a year then.
$103 a year. I appreciate that you give me more than $103 a year.
I would hope so. That way we couldn't send you to conventions.
And it also specifically says that the congregation was not actually able to raise that sum of money. Even though the agreed price was $103, Mr. Meineke was never paid the full sum of $103. We still might owe him money.
Right, exactly.
Dozen eggs here and
Yeah,
there.
couple chickens, eggs, no.
Likely.
What a barter, I can imagine.
It specifically said that he was perfectly content with what he received. But now that there was a consistent meeting time, now that the group was consistently meeting as a church, then came the moment, March 5th, 1882, the Evangelische Lutherische Kirche of the Unaltered Augsburg Confession von Wall Lake was chartered. For those of you who don't read German, that's the Evangelical Lutheran Church of the Unaltered Augsburg Confession, Wall Lake.
Like the cornerstone says upstairs.
Church. Yep. That was the name even when they built the second church. We'll talk about why that name changed here in a few minutes. But in fall of 1882, the church called their first full-time pastor. Again, Mr. Meineke was a seminary student, so I get the sense it would be what we would call today a vicarage. He had been contracted for a year, kind of as an internship. And then in fall of 1882, Pastor Mueller was called as our first pastor. After he had to return to the seminary to finish his education, so he was installed in 1883. He lived in Cook Township, and he preached here every other week. So we were sharing him, I believe it was with, yes, he was living in Cook Township. He was also serving Cook Township. He would be in Cook Township one week. He'd be in Wall Lake the next week.
I believe the cemetery is still there, that's the one I'm thinking.
Probably.
The parsonage is there too, but they sold that out and tore down the church. And they got some funds to maintain the cemetery, and that's about it.
I'm sure. What you find when you read a lot of these histories is there are a lot of churches, a lot of these little, now they're nothing more than, blips in the road. Some of them I found are even nothing more than just 2 or 3 houses in an area. But again, this is the 1880s. We're just starting to settle towns. We don't know what are going to be the town, what are going to grow into the big towns and little towns. Not to mention there aren't cars at that time. I was just talking with Jack Newtsman yesterday, and he was talking about how, when he went to school, you had schools every 2 miles, so that you could walk, everyone could walk to school. It was very similar with churches. You had a lot of churches back then that simply don't exist anymore, because the advent of the automobile means that, if I have to drive 15 miles to get to church, I have to drive 15 miles to get to church. I can do that relatively quickly. Things that they couldn't do necessarily as easily back then. And again, once Pastor Mueller was here, on July 2nd, 1883, the congregation voted to build a new church building. They raised funds, and they built a church for $970. First church was built for $970.
That's the one you used to sit right south of the parsonage?
That's where it sat, but this was the first church. You're thinking the second church.
Okay, they put a different second one on that same lot then?
Yes. This was just, like there's a picture of it here that I can show you. With the parsonage right next door to it. They later added a schoolroom, and they kept expanding that church. The church that many of you remember is the old church. That was the second church building. That was built a little bit later. I should have had that date here in front of me. But...
yeah, it's different from the one that was there.
Yep. Yeah, so they now had a permanent church building in Wall Lake. And the church continued to grow. It continued to flourish. Now, what I can say, the church history does not include whether we were a part of a synod when we were founded. There was the Iowa Synod in Iowa. Wartburg Seminary was a part of the Iowa Synod. I don't know if we were specifically a part of a synod at the time. But in 1901, the congregation decided they wanted to join the LCMS. They went to the Iowa District Convention, which was being held in Loudon, Iowa. As a fun side note, none of you would know this, but my great-grandfather was at that meeting because the Wentz are big in Trinity Loudon is the church that my father's family is all from. So I found it fascinating when I saw that we joined the synod in Loudon, Iowa. But anyway, in 1901 we joined the LCMS officially. Now, anybody remember what happened? Not necessarily just with the church, but in general, in 1914, World War I.
Yeah.
Now,
Not well.
yeah, we were on our second pastor at the time, Pastor Disher. Germans were now the enemy.
Yeah.
Well, one of the things that, for a lot of Lutherans in the United States, I had talked about this in a class that I had taken, where we had discussed this. I might have mentioned this in passing last week. For a lot of people, what made a church Lutheran? Most people couldn't tell you the difference between Lutheran and Presbyterian and Methodist. Well, what was the difference they knew? Lutherans spoke German. We still had church in the mother tongue. So for most people, that's what made a church Lutheran. But all of a sudden, in 1914, we're fighting the Germans. Germans are the bad guys. So, nine German, America, apple pie, USA, baseball. And so we had to suddenly switch from German to English.
There's a lot of anti-German sentiment. Not as bad as it was for the Japanese World War II, but it was bad for the Germans in World War I.
As it was, and as people have pointed out, you can actually, in some ways, see this, because I'm sure you may never have noticed this, but I can go to Carroll and I can go get Chinese food, I can get Mexican food. We can go up to Early and we can get Cuban food. A lot of the people in this area have German heritage. Is there a German restaurant? No, because you didn't want to be associated with the Germans. We're Americans. No, 999, not German, 9. So suddenly, we had to switch to English. And frankly, the entire LCMS was dealing with this. Of all of a sudden, we had to go from German to, we're good Americans, we speak English. After the war ended, we did resume some German services. The history doesn't even really say that we switched back to German. It just said that we, in 1941, we completely stopped German services. It said in 1914 we switched to English services, and in 1941 we completely stopped. So my guess would be that they had paused all German services because we're good Americans. And then after the war, when anti-German sentiment died down a little bit, we resumed German services. In 1912, the parsonage was enlarged. The original church was deemed too small for the growing congregation's needs. So they moved the original church to the north edge of town, where it sat until 1981. Many of you may have seen it, you just may not have realized that it was the old Lutheran church. I can't tell you where it sat.
Right across from my brother's house, my brother Brad's house, on that corner.
Sure.
There used to be a whole, there was a church, there were some other buildings, it was like almost a farm place.
To the east.
To the east.
Yeah, so it'll be the northeast corner of that intersection.
Yes.
Sure. But yes, for those of you who remember a church sitting there.
My dad farmed the whole area, someone out, he rented that area, and like, we used to keep our horses there. And inside the church, that's where the horses were.
So see, you actually do remember that church.
You guys weren't in the family
I
yet.
remember the silo sitting there.
I never made it that far north, I don't think.
Fair enough.
I'm pretty sure I remember this as a kid. It was, I remember the steeple
How
on the
far north
building.
of town was that?
Just at the intersection.
the Catholic.
Where my brother Brad lives.
So that grove used to be in that silo.
Yes, yes, that silo was
Any
a,
buildings there?
oh yeah.
No, right, it was.
I was about to say, I mean, they've been gone for 40 years, so.
Wow, it was
You
there.
talked-
I've been going to Riders since I was about that tall. My
Pretty
dad
sure.
had feet, so I don't remember seeing the buildings there.
Do you remember?
Just the silo and the grove.
I think that's where it was. Was, he said until 81 and they.
Yeah. It said the Little Frame Church was moved to the north edge of town and was destroyed in 1981.
It was not.
We had some religious horses.
So that's when we built the church building that many of you remember from your childhood, the 1914, the second church, with gas light fixtures. It was a very, very fancy church here that we had, with the gas light fixtures, and they had put in a bell. So, look at that. It talks about that they bought the bell for $428, and they discontinued tolling the bell for funerals when people died when we moved to this building in 1956. Good news, I brought it back. I did it! Yes!
So it's the same bell.
This is the same bell. The bell we have in the bell tower is the bell that came over from the old church.
We had that inspected, and the guy that inspected said, that bell is bulletproof. It says, nothing wrong with it.
Well, it was built in 1908, probably solid brass, so.
I don't know. I didn't go up there. I got halfway up once and I said, no. Especially after the flashlight stopped working. I'm like, okay, God. It was originally in the lawn of the first church, but when they built the second church, they built a bell tower. And again, since this predates all of us, none of us would remember this. The church actually had a bit of a tragedy. Pastor Disher died of Spanish flu in 1919. So one of the things that the church did, his wife had already passed. I don't remember what she had passed from, but his passing left, I believe it was 4 orphans. Let me see here. I can probably specifically find it. He left behind a family who needed him sorely, and it was here that the congregation did what they could to lighten the burden. They paid the funeral expenses and purchased a home for the family. The church took on the care of the orphans. That's actually when we purchased the 405 Center Street lot. That we later tore down that house and built the parsonage that's there now. Oh, sorry, that's 405 Main Street. Center Street was where the parsonage was. 405 Main Street, we bought that house. But yeah, the oldest was 21, the youngest was 5. They had 7 children. My apologies. But one had passed away. So they had 6 children that the congregation took care of and raised these orphans. So, interesting note from the church's history. We then called Pastor Adolf Schwitter. I don't know why, for some reason in this book it never refers to him as Adolf Schwitter. It always refers to him as A.D. Schwitter. Gee, I don't know why. Something about that name. Weird. Anyway.
Where was that?
This book was written for the 100th anniversary in 1982.
But Adolf, what year was that he came in?
He was pastor here from 1919 through 1939.
Well, wouldn't that have bad connotation to it then?
Not then, no. Again, he would have been called Adolf back then, but our revisionist history, we don't want to, we just ignore that name. No. Pastor A.D. Schwitter. But Pastor Schwitter was here for 20 years, and in that time, and it's interesting to note for our congregation's history, in that time, the Iowa district decided it was too large for one man to handle as president. So that's when the Iowa district of Lutheran Church Missouri Synod split into two, the East and the West. And Pastor Schwitter was elected district president. So the original Iowa District West office was Peace Wall Lake. It moved to Fort Dodge when Pastor Schwitter took a call to St. Paul's, Fort Dodge. He remained district president, but moved to St. Paul's, Fort Dodge.
We're more centrally located.
You're preaching to the choir here.
He said that if he ever accidentally ends up president, he's going to move it.
I do not ever want to be district president. Do not get me wrong. I believe my exact comments to Hannah were, if something happened and everyone else in the district died, and I suddenly somehow had to be district president, one of my first acts would be, we're moving it to Wall Lake because we're more centrally located. We can buy one of the commercial lots there on the south end of town. And especially because we're recording, again, I want to make this clear. I do not want to be district president. I am perfectly happy being a parish pastor. Let the record show, I do not want to ever be district president. And the funny thing is, actually, after Pastor Schwitter stepped down from the role of district president, does anyone know who the second district president of Iowa District West was? His replacement, Peace Wall Lake, Pastor Berner. Pastor Berner was elected and I believe served a 2-year term as district president. Pastor Berner was here for 8 years. And again, that was 1939 to 1947. Anti-German sentiments were high again. Once again, it was not a time to be German or to speak German. So, after Pearl Harbor, it was officially declared, we are discontinuing all German services. We are good Americans. And I don't know what, I believe it would have been at this time that we changed the congregation name from the Evangelische Lutheran Kirche von Wall Lake to Peace. No. We're not those warmongers from Germany. Peace Lutheran Church. The congregation stayed the same. The name simply changed.
What year was that?
It doesn't specifically say here, but since everything I've seen in the record say that when the second church was built, we were still the German name. My guess would be it was probably around this time that we changed to Peace. But that's kind of the history. And again, we could talk about the current parsonage was built, I believe, in 1951. We've had a number of pastors for our years. Pastor Christensen served from 47 to 52. Pastor Weiss from 52 to 67. And of course, he was here when they decided that they needed to build a new church as the congregation kept growing. This facility was built on donated land. Pastor Nagler, Pastor Becker, and then of course Pastor Carlisle. Questions about the history of the church, comments. And again, everything I got is from these two fun books. I think we still have a couple copies up in Jen's office. If you don't know where yours is. Most of the families were probably given these at some time. I've got
I think we have shoes at home.
I've got Sharon Rowetters myself. Yes.
So you were what number pastor then?
I believe I am the 10th pastor in our history. Yes, I am the 10th pastor in the history of Peace Wall Lake. 1882 to 2025, I am the 10th pastor in the history of the church. I don't know. My phone's being used to record, or I could look up and I could tell you how long each guy was pastor. Because I went ahead and I made the list. But if you want to, I can't do the math quickly off the top of my head. But Pastor Mueller was 1883 to 1907. Pastor Disher was 1907 to 1919. And of course, as I mentioned, he died of Spanish flu. Pastor Schwitter was 1919 to 1937. Pastor Berner was 37 to 47. Christensen was 47 to 52. Weiss was 52 to 67. Pastor Nagler was 68 to 78. Pastor Becker was 79 through 83. And then 82, 83, somewhere in there. And then Pastor Carlisle was here from 83 until 23. So, yeah.
I think Scots were the first ones married in the new church, weren't they?
I believe so.
And then I think we were the second ones.
I believe they told me they were the first ones married in the new building. The unaltered Augsburg Confession.
In plans, it's used as constructed.
It looks like VAC.
And I can kind of touch on this a little bit because it serves as a good segue if there are no other questions about the history of the church. It serves as a good segue. I had mentioned that after the Peace of Augsburg, you kind of had a lot of questions about, you had a lot of different church bodies claiming to be Lutheran. One of the issues that happened after Martin Luther had died was Philip Melanchthon, who, for those of you who don't remember, was Luther's right-hand man. He was a very close friend of Martin Luther. He was the one who had actually written the Augsburg Confession down. A big group had sat together, worked on it, and figured it out. But Philip Melanchthon was the man who actually wrote it down. Well, especially after Luther's death, Melanchthon really became friends with a lot of what we would call Reformed. Melanchthon felt because he had written it down, the Augsburg Confession was his. So he released what was called the Variata, the change, a varied Augsburg Confession that was more open to Reformed theology. Which is why churches had to start to specify, because again, after the Peace of Augsburg, you're allowed to be either Lutheran or Roman Catholic. The Reformed could still exist because they go, we subscribe to the Augsburg Confession. This variation that Philip Melanchthon put out, we subscribe to the Augsburg Confession, which is why, this is going to sound terrible, but true Lutherans had to say, no, we subscribe to the unaltered Augsburg Confession, the original, what was presented at the Diet of Augsburg. That is what we subscribe to. And that's why it would still have been in the church title and why it was still on the cornerstone of the second church. because it was to specify that we subscribe to the unaltered Augsburg Confession. So, I had mentioned that we'll kind of start to talk about a little bit about what the LCMS believes, so that we can kind of identify what everybody else believes. What I've really found in doing my work, I think it'll be easier, because again, we could really get into the weeds about what Lutheran doctrine is and all of that. I think what would be easiest would be, next week especially, we'll compare kind of what the evangelical Lutheran Church in America believes compared to what the LCMS believes. A lot of people have asked why are there different Lutheran synods.
Well, isn't the evangelical combination of several different Lutheran churches that came together?
Yes, a number of Lutheran churches merged together to form the ELCA. And we'll talk about that. But frankly, that you could actually point to, there are a number of Lutheran synods that merged into the LCMS. Again, we were originally the German Lutheran Synod, the German Evangelical Lutheran Synod of Missouri, Ohio, and other states. We've had other groups that have come in. There was the English Synod that merged into our church. There was the Slovak Evangelical Lutheran Church that merged into the LCMS. So we have had other church bodies merge. But yes, the ELCA was formed by a merger of other church bodies. So we'll kind of talk about that a little bit next week. But I want to hit on, there are kind of four major things that you'll see that kind of makes a big difference with when you're looking at church bodies. There are kind of four things that define the differences. I apologize, I'm going to erase this. I have it on a sheet if any of you want it, or you can just look at your Brown history books if you'd like. But there are four things that kind of, in a lot of ways, determine. There are a lot of things that can make differences in churches, but there are four kind of central questions to each church. They're polity. How are decisions made? For example, what is the polity of the Roman Catholic Church? How are decisions made at the Roman Catholic Church? The bishop tells each congregation what they're going to do. Does St. Joseph get to say, now wait a minute, we don't want to do that? No. The bishop tells them what they're going to do. What's the polity of the Presbyterian Church? That's the Anglican Church. The Presbyterian Church is named such because the decisions are made by presbyters. They don't have the bishop and the pope telling them what happens. They have a group of, usually men, deciding what the congregation is going to do, and everybody follows. I'll try to make this one easy. What's the polity of congregational churches? The congregation votes on what it is. What's our polity? Yes. We're a synod, which means we walk together. Which means that you will not see anyone from St. Louis come in here and tell us this is what you need to be doing. But there are guidelines of, okay, we've agreed to walk together. So in some ways we have an ecclesiastical structure. In some ways we have a congregational structure. Because again, the voters' assembly makes the decisions. But we also in some ways have a presbyter polity. Because again, we have the board of elders that in a lot of ways drives what we do, especially on Sunday morning. So we are kind of a hybrid of them. But the polity is always a big one. Their view on scriptures. What is scripture? Is always a big one. I'm almost out of time, but again, I'll simply remind you back to our discussion of the Pope. How do Catholics view Scripture? They are hand in hand with tradition. Whereas we would say that Scripture alone makes our doctrine. What would they say is the chief article of faith? That will tell you a lot about what is important to any individual church body. And then the important documents in each church body's history. Because obviously, most church bodies will be bound to specific documents. Or they won't be bound to any documents, which, again, will define who they are. So we will get into this more next week. Any last-second questions before we go up?
So once in a while you hear a church saying, oh, they left the ELCA. Do they have to land in like Western or Wisconsin Senate, or do they have to land in
No.
the Senate? No.
I'll say that for a second. So again, synod means walking together. So like Hannah and I are walking together. What happens if I decide I don't want to walk with her anymore? I can walk by myself. Or I can choose to walk with Boomer. I can choose to walk with anybody I want to. Or I can choose to walk by myself. So no, if they leave the ELCA, they do not have to walk with anyone. Any other questions? All right. We will see you upstairs for service and the baptism. Would you please stop the camera?